what if there was a cure for Alzheimer's disease and no one knew? I wrote this article 2 months after my husband improved, and it was just a little case report. It talked about, what happened with him, but also about Dr. Beach's ketone ester, and that you could get much higher ketone levels, that potentially this could be a cure for Alzheimer's. Dr. Beach, believed that if somebody got this early enough, they might completely be able to prevent it, and that people that had it might improve significantly.
A few weeks ago, I met a wonderful doctor. I was at a conference in America, and I'd never met this lady before, but I had read her books. And her books have helped my mum, who suffers from Alzheimer's, in many, many ways. And the question is this: what if a spoonful of coconut oil each day could slow down the symptoms of Alzheimer's? Mary, thank you for joining me.
Oh, thank you so much for inviting me to come on your program.
Well, you're a superstar. This book here is the one that my dad has read on behalf of my mother. Sadly, my mother can no longer read. But then at the conference the other day, I found some more books that you had written, and I'm starting to work my way through them. And you kindly signed inside of each one, and you went, all 4 books. I went, please sign all 4 for me. So let's start with that question. Can a teaspoon of, and we'll go to detail in a minute, but let's have a quick yes, no. Can a teaspoon of coconut oil slow down Alzheimer's?
Yeah, it takes a little bit of time to explain this, but basically what's going on, a big part of what's going on in the Alzheimer brain is a problem of getting glucose into the brain and then into certain brain cells within the brain. And this is going on for 10 or 20 years before a person even has symptoms of Alzheimer's. And it just gets worse and worse. It progresses throughout the brain as the disease advances. And so in place of glucose as fuel, it's possible that an alternative fuel could help somebody with Alzheimer's. And so ketones is one of those alternative fuels. And ketones come from breaking down fat in our body. People here in the US eat a very high carb diet. If you eat a high carb diet, you're not going to have ketones floating around. But as you stop eating, fasting basically, 10, 12 hours, you use up the glucose that's stored in your body, you start breaking down fat. Some of that fat is converted to ketones, which are taken up very quickly by most of the organs in the body, except the liver where they're made. But the brain in this case, and the brain cells can quickly switch from using glucose to ketones. And so you have an alternative fuel for somebody who has Alzheimer's disease. And studies in Canada, Dr. Stephen Cunnane at Sherbrooke University has actually been able to show with ketone and glucose PET scans that ketones are in fact taken up normally in the areas of the brain affected by Alzheimer's, where there's decreased glucose uptake. It was assumed for a long time that those cells were just dead, but they're not dead. Many of them, some of them probably are dead, but many of them may just be dormant, like a car that needs fuel in the tank. And you provide that fuel, and then the car will run again. So something as simple as that is a way of thinking of it. So the cool thing about coconut oil is that it contains fats called medium chain triglycerides. And medium chain triglycerides, when you consume them, regardless of what you eat, your liver will convert part of that to ketones. The ketones enter the blood and they cross into the brain and can provide fuel to the cells. So I found out. Oh, go ahead.
No, that's great. So, because we're going to go into lots of detail in a moment, but right up front then, what we're saying is the coconut oil, and I've seen this with my mum, right? And I'm a believer. I take coconut oil every day. But what we're saying is it changes or helps or is a catalyst or it's the beginning of changing the fuel source in the brain, and it's the changing of the fuel source that may be helping us.
Exactly.
Okay, so let's go all the way back then. Let's go back as many years as you want. Let's start with your story.
Yeah. Okay, so I'm a neonatologist, a newborn specialist. I did that for 30 years in newborn intensive care units in the Tampa Bay area of Florida. My husband was an accountant, and that worked perfectly for our family. He was able to work from home since I was based in the hospital. He did accounting and managing of my practice. But when he was 51 years old, he started having problems with his memory that were very significant. And at the point where he started forgetting if he'd been to the bank and the post office and having trouble getting real simple tax reports done. It was a great concern. And he was also depressed at that time. A neuropsychiatrist thought that he mentioned dementia, but he thought that more likely the memory issues were related to depression and put him on an antidepressant. Well, he continued to get worse. And at age 54, he was diagnosed with early onset Alzheimer's disease, which was a crushing blow. You can imagine, we had grandparents on both sides of our family that lived into their 90s, and we thought we'd live to a ripe old age, retire together, all of that. And then suddenly everything looked very bleak. And by 2006, when he was 56 years old, he could no longer do any accounting, couldn't even turn on a computer or use a calculator. And this had been his life. He'd been on a computer day and night for years, for decades, since they were invented, basically.
And this is an interesting point to jump in, because people have preconceptions sometimes of Alzheimer's. And I always say my mum's got it and she was very bright. I've got a friend whose dad was a rocket scientist. Seriously, he was a rocket scientist and he got Alzheimer's in his 50s. Your husband, a very bright man, an accountant, got it. So this proves that we must have no stigma around Alzheimer's. We just need to do what we can to prevent it and make it better where we can.
Right. And the idea that you can use it or lose it, that if you use it, you won't lose it. Well, he was using it every single day. And it just, chopped away at him a little bit at a time. And, people with Alzheimer's, it doesn't happen overnight. It's a process that can take years until the person becomes unable to take care of themselves, so there's just little things along the way early on, and then they start to pile up. And there's Steve. He was an avid kayaker. He worked out in the yard constantly, physically active. He read novel after novel. I mean, he really was not somebody you would expect to get Alzheimer's disease, and especially not that early.
Okay, so this starts to unfold. A big surprise, because obviously very intelligent man, well-read, accountant, starts to unfold. And then how does this come about that obviously now as a result you've written 4 amazing books? How did you start to learn about, of course you're a doctor, so normally doctors think about medication and drugs and things like that. And how did you end up discovering a natural way of helping with the symptoms of Alzheimer's?
Yeah. Well, the first clue I got that nutrition could have anything to do with it was an article that I read right at the end of 2006. And it was on the Mediterranean diet. And basically, they had done a study in which they found that people with Alzheimer's who ate the most Mediterranean-like diet lived on average 4 years longer than people that ate the least Mediterranean-like diet. And this was eye-opening to me, because I had never thought that nutrition could have anything to do with Alzheimer's. But I started reading everything I could get my hands on. We were on the convenience food diet. Doctors don't get very good, if any, nutrition training. I had 3 hours one afternoon. That's it, on diet. What diet, how it can harm you, how diet can help you improve. And so, basically I read about all different kinds of diets. And then I did settle on the Mediterranean diet, and we completely restructured our diet, went to whole foods, whole grains, eating, the main fat was olive oil, eating a lot more fish, a lot more vegetables, fresh vegetables. I learned how to cook basically, instead of putting a box meal into the microwave oven. We both, I felt like we both got healthier. I may have benefited more than my husband. I lost a lot of weight. I felt better. All the carb cravings stopped, because the Mediterranean diet is a naturally less carbohydrate diet than the standard American diet.
Yeah.
And so that started in 2006. And but he progressed. He continued to get worse. I don't know if it slowed it down. I have no idea. But in 2008, he was going downhill very rapidly. He could no longer remember to feed himself. I had to have somebody with him when I was working to keep him out of trouble, to make sure that he ate. And he had trouble finishing sentences. He was very slow. Conversation was difficult, very sluggish in the morning, couldn't pick up his feet and run. He walked really strange, kind of a stiff gait, couldn't tie his shoes, very basics that he couldn't do. And he was, there are 7 stages of Alzheimer's, and he was basically between stage 5 and 6, so quite advanced. And I was always watching for clinical trials, and 2 trials came along. This was in May of 2008. They were 2 different drugs, and I was able to schedule screenings for him 2 days in a row when I was off. And the night before the first screening, I got online, and just by chance, I happened on a press release about a medical food that claimed to improve the cognition and memory of nearly half of the people with Alzheimer's that took it. And I had been looking for the risks and benefits of these other 2, drugs, and I came upon this by accident. And it didn't really say what this was, what the product was. They just called it AC1202. So I decided I had to dig deeper, and I was able to find their patent application, which was kind of a miracle in and of itself. And, they explained this problem of insulin resistance in the brain, the problem of getting glucose into the brain, and how ketones could provide this alternative fuel, and how when you consume MCT oil, some of that, is converted to ketones. And it's a brilliant idea. It was a brilliant idea. And I knew about, that during starvation, from medical school, that some of the fuel, ketones provides, fuel to the brain. So I was familiar with that, but I was especially familiar with MCT oil because of my background as a neonatologist, a newborn specialist.
Mm-hmm.
We used to add it to the feedings of our tiniest preemies in the newborn ICU. These are babies under 2 pounds. They would absorb it well, they'd get home faster. So I knew what it was. And I think if I wasn't a neonatologist and didn't know what MCT oil was, I might have assumed, oh, this is something you cannot get. Mm-hmm. And then once in the patent application, I read that it was extracted from coconut oil, which was new information to me. I did not know that. I figured that MCT oil was something hospitals could get, but I didn't know that it was available on the shelf. And it had been there, as it turned out, for decades. Bodybuilders had been using it. People had been using it for weight loss. But I knew I could get coconut oil. So I'm learning about this on the internet the night before a screening. And it's about 1 a.m. The screening's at 9 a.m. So I didn't have time to do anything about it before that first screening. And so we went to the screening, and Steve needed to get at least 16 out of 30 points on the mini mental status exam. It's a 30-point easy test. You get 29 or 30 points, and that's considered normal. He only scored 14, and we were extremely disappointed. The doctor had him draw a clock, and it was very disorganized. A few little circles, 4 numbers, no big circle, no hands of the clock. And she pulled me aside and she said, he's on the verge of severe Alzheimer's. And so I thought, what do we have to lose? I knew I could get coconut oil at a health food store, wondered why it was there, didn't know coconut oil might be healthy. And picked it up. And when we got home, I got online to remind myself, what are the medium chain triglycerides? And then I found a USDA website that gave me the fatty acid breakdown of coconut oil.
I'm going to stop.
I learned that it was 60% medium chain triglycerides.
I'm going to stop you there again, because we'll get to that in a second. 2 things I want to pick up on. Don't feel bad about not learning about nutrition in med school, because the same in England, 5 years training to be a doctor, less than 2 or 3 hours in 5 years about nutrition. They just never get taught nutrition. Some doctors I know have never once sat in a lecture on nutrition, and yet we know that 4 out of 5 hospital beds are taken up normally as a result of a chronic disease that could have been prevented or made not as
Mhm.
bad or severe by getting nutrition right. So everything's
Yeah.
completely wrong. So don't feel about that. And
Mhm.
the test that your husband Steve
Yeah.
did to get onto that, or tried to get onto that
Mhm.
clinical trial. I've done this 3 times with my mother. So it depends obviously same in America. It depends on
Mhm.
what clinical trial you're trying to get them on. But for those that don't know, they're normally looking for a score of between X and Y, because they want to, maybe their drug is for people that
Right.
are advanced or in the middle or early. And sadly for my
Mhm.
mom, I
Mhm.
was the same. I said, "Oh, Dad, she'll get I can't remember the number it was now, but let's say she needed to get 20 out of 40 on this one." I went, "Oh, she'll cruise that. She can still do that." And every time she just came below. So I've never got my mom on any clinical trial, for the same
Mhm.
reasons as you had with Steve, sadly. But she is on coconut oil. So I interrupted you. I do apologise. Let's jump into MCT, and what the difference between MCT 8, 10, and how all this fits together. That'd be great.
Yeah. So basically, um, yeah, I figured out what the medical food dose was that they used in their clinical trials. And I calculated how much coconut oil I would need to give my husband to equal that dose. And it turned out to be a little over 2 tablespoons. You need a lot more coconut oil to get the equivalent amount of medium chain triglycerides. I thought, well, that's reasonable. So the next day, he's scheduled for a screening around 1 in the afternoon. So at breakfast, I put a little over 2 tablespoons of coconut oil in his oatmeal. And I had the same, and I had indigestion because I have no gallbladder. But I quickly adapted to that. I decided, if this was good for somebody who actually has Alzheimer's, it might also work as prevention. So, and I have Alzheimer's extensively on my mother's side of the family and also on my father's side. So I thought I'm going to take this myself. And so he takes the coconut oil. We had to travel about an hour for the screening, and around 1 in the afternoon, he has the mini mental status exam, and he pulls his score up from 14 to 18, needed 16 to qualify, and he got into the study. And so
Fantastic.
we were overjoyed. We were overjoyed. We probably shouldn't have been, because it turned out to be a really bad drug, but but I didn't know if it was really good luck or the coconut oil, medium chain triglycerides, or what it was, but I thought we're going to keep this going. And the very next day, and every day after that, I started giving him a little over 2 tablespoons at breakfast. But then I started giving it throughout the day. I started cooking with it. I reasoned, when I read the patent application, the ketones from MCT oil peak at about 90 minutes to 2 hours, and then they drop off. And in their studies, they had come back to baseline at about 3 hours. So, but the brain needs fuel 24/7. So, what do you do the other 21 hours of the day? So, I reasoned that why stop with just one dose of this? Why not, give it throughout the day with meals? And that's what I did. Started cooking with it, adding it to other foods. I found cookbooks and recipes, and coconut oil is actually very easy to use. It basically needs to go in a warm food. And he improved every day. He said it was like a light switch came back on in his brain the day he
Wow.
started the coconut oil. He told me that a number of times. Yeah. And then within a few days, he started kind of bouncing down the hall instead of very sluggish, and whistling and making jokes, talking better, more animation in his face. He knew that he had Alzheimer's. He knew what he had lost. And the two of us, by the fourth or fifth day, we said to each other, our life has changed. Something has changed here. Something real has happened. And we're going to keep this going. And so everything became coconut in our house. Coconut milk's loaded with coconut oil. So we started drinking that too. And then I decided, okay, I've got to um, talk to somebody involved in ketone research. And I found on Wikipedia the name of Dr. Richard Veitch, who he's an MD, and he did his PhD at Oxford in biochemistry. He worked with Hans Krebs, and helped him work out the Krebs cycle, which is very famous. That's how energy is produced in our cells, through the cycle that they identified. And he had been studying ketones for decades, but intensively since the mid 90s. He believed that ketones could be therapeutic in some way, especially for people with Alzheimer's, Parkinson's, Huntington's disease, multiple sclerosis, people with congestive heart failure. They found that ketones are a more efficient fuel for the heart than glucose. So many different disorders that could conceivably respond to this. And he had been developing a ketone ester, a drink that you could take that would greatly increase ketone levels, much more than coconut or MCT oil. And when I talked to him, I had a list of questions. I didn't tell him what I had done with my husband, but I asked him, theoretically, could coconut oil help somebody with Alzheimer's, since that he has these medium chain triglycerides? And he said he thought that the levels would be way too low, that it wouldn't be enough, and that somebody had approached him a few years earlier about MCT oil, and he had told them the same thing. Well, the person he had talked to had gone on to get a patent and develop this medical food. So, and I knew that it had helped my husband, but 2 weeks after all of this happened, Steve drew another clock, and this time it had the full circle. All the numbers were there in order. It was messy. There were a whole lot of what looked like hands of the clock, but he told me later that he was trying to line up the numbers across each other on the clock. He was trying to make it perfect. It was far from perfect, but it was so much better than 2 weeks earlier. And I faxed it to Dr. Veach, and he called me and he said, "This is unexpected," basically were his words. He was amazed, and he started sending me hypothesis papers about ketones that he had written with others and himself. He put me in touch with several ketone researchers. It was incredible. Dr. George Cahill Jr., who had they had done starvation studies in the 1960s. So these men were quite elderly. And he was the one that identified that the brain can fill in 60% of its energy as ketones during starvation, during prolonged starvation. He was very excited. Dr. Theodore Van Illy and Dr. Sammy Hashem, who had discovered that MCT oil is ketogenic back in the 1960s. I got to talk to these pioneers of ketone research. It was just incredible. And they provided me so much information. Dr. Veach really still felt that higher ketone levels would be needed to really make a difference in Alzheimer's. Dr. Hashem, Dr. Van Italy said they thought lower levels might be possible. They kind of agreed with me. And then probably about 6 weeks or so after we started the coconut oil, Dr. Veach convinced me to start adding some MCT oil, because the ketone levels are higher from MCT oil. It's 100% MCTs. Coconut oil is 60%. So, the levels are going to be higher. And they were. We actually measured Steve's levels after taking coconut oil 2 doses in a day and taking MCT oil, and they were higher. So I started, but Dr. Veach wanted me to stop the coconut oil.
For those that don't know, Mary, you can take coconut oil, which has various types of fat, and correct me if I'm wrong on this, in it, but MCT8 and MCT10 are particularly the ones that are the medium chain triglycerides that can get into the liver and turn into ketones faster than the other parts. So yes, coconut oil on itself is good because it has an element of it. But if you go pure MCT8 or pure MCT10, I don't know if that one still is the case, but certainly 8, that gets converted, obviously the higher ratio.
Right. So the blood levels are higher, but there's something interesting about coconut oil that I didn't know until years later. 2016 is when the study came out. A company in Japan, they had actually invited me. I had spoken at a symposium that they had on MCT oil. They were manufacturers of MCT since the 1970s, and they were interested in why my husband Steve could have improved so much with coconut oil despite the relatively low ketone levels. And what they found was that lauric acid, which is C12, which is half of the fat in coconut oil, when they put it in cultures of astrocytes, which are brain cells that nourish the neurons, they found that it potently stimulated ketones within the astrocytes.
Wow.
And astrocytes shuttle fuel to the neurons, and astrocytes are known to be able to shuttle ketones to the neurons. So that may very well have explained why somebody like my husband and many other people now, respond to coconut oil. That's as the fuel's a more direct effect in the brain. It's not obvious with the blood levels.
Yeah.
So that's my gut feeling, that it has something to do with that. It still has to be proven in live creatures. I've been trying to encourage a couple people who can do that type of research to do it, and waiting with bated breath to, for results on that. But
So would you say then,
that's
if you compare
basically what happened.
if you compare the two, then C8 on its own, or C8 C10, or just MCT oil, which you can buy on Amazon in the UK, which is what I've been taking that recently, not coconut oil. But are we saying for certainly the MCT8 will probably get you into ketosis and a higher level of ketosis quicker, but you're saying there's added benefits in the C12, which might not help so much with ketosis, but has a different biological pathway in neurology that may. So do we do a mixture of both, or just stick with coconut oil?
Yeah. So I decided to do both. My husband improved so much. I mean, during that first 6 to 8 weeks, he was back to tying his shoes. He had tremors that went away. He
Wow.
had he started walking normally again and could pick up his feet and run again. I mean, he had physical symptoms. His mood went from depressed to hope for the future. He was very hopeful. He felt just so much better. Conversation was much better. There were so many things that improved. At 3.5 months to 4 months, he announced that he could read again. He hadn't read for about a year and a half. And he said, he explained to me that the words had been shaking around on the page, like they went into little boxes and moved around on the page, and that's why he couldn't read. And that stopped.
Oh
And he
wow.
could actually read. And then around 9, 10, 11 months, he started, he would read something like Scientific American and tell me hours later what he had read, details of what he had
Wow.
read. So
That's
major
fantastic.
progression that continued through that time. It is fantastic. And, basically I started mixing the coconut and MCT oil. I thought, I'm going to keep the coconut oil. Dr. Van Italy actually encouraged me to keep the coconut oil. He said there might be something else about it that we don't know
Yeah.
yet. The other cool thing about lauric acid, so I think the immediate effect for my husband was the fuel effect, the
Mm.
ketones. But there are other things about coconut oil. The lauric acid is also antimicrobial. It's highly antimicrobial. And there are just hundreds of studies implicating various viruses like herpes simplex virus. My husband had fever blisters that are caused by that virus. He had an infection around his eye when he was 29. He was quite sick, which may have been the trigger for him. And lauric acid it dissolves the lipid capsules of many different kind of viruses, including the COVID virus.
Incredible.
It kills many types of bacteria. It kills spirochetes that live in our mouth that cause cavities, just many kinds of organisms. So he frequently had these big fat fever blisters that wouldn't go away for several weeks, go away for a week, come back. That stopped. I mean, he rarely had another one after that. So, if infections accelerating Alzheimer's or contributing to it in some way, lauric acid may have been controlling that infection. There's substances in coconut oil that are antioxidants and anti-inflammatory substances, and inflammation. If you have Alzheimer's, there is inflammation in your brain. And so, substances in coconut oil that may have been controlling inflammation. The combination of the MCTs, and it turns out that MCTs, the C8 and C10, are transported into the brain. That's known for sure. And they're used directly as fuel. So they're also an alternative fuel for the brain. So part of it is the ketones, but
So,
the other part are the
so
MCTs.
can I,
And a group recently,
can I
a
just
group,
can
oh,
I
go
can I
ahead.
just get you to explain that a bit further, because this is where my knowledge now you're teaching me new things. So we
Yeah.
know MCT8 and MCT10 in the liver gets converted quite easily, quite quickly, because the way it travels from the intestines straight into the liver. It doesn't normally go through the normal sort of route. It goes straight into the liver. That's why we can get, when I go and play a game of tennis, I'll take MCT, take MCT8, big energy kick rather than having a glucosade
Yeah.
drink or something full of sugar. So we get that instant energy kick. My
Yeah.
understanding in the past till today was that
Yeah.
converted, that MCT8, 10 converts into ketones really quickly, instant energy. But are you saying in addition to that, some of that stays as MCT
Mhm.
8 and 10 and is an energy in its own right.
Right.
Wow.
Right.
Wow.
Correct. Correct.
That's
And there's
fascinating.
another neat thing about C10. C10 converts more slowly to ketones than C8, but C10 stimulates mitochondria to multiply. So mitochondria are tiny little factories within the cells that there's hundreds of them in cells, and especially neurons, hundreds to 1,000 or so in each one, which is hard to imagine. But these little factories make ATP, which is the energy molecule that allows our cells to function. This is nearly every cell in the body. And mitochondria also put out thousands of proteins. They're like factories. And if there's not fuel, these aren't operating, it's like, pulling the switch on the, turning off the power in the factory, nothing's going to come out of it. So C10 causes these to multiply. So
Wow.
you have the potential to produce more ATP, produce more of these proteins. And C10 is also anticonvulsant. It has anticonvulsant properties that is very similar in effect to some of the anticonvulsants that are on the market that people are taking as medication. So in the world of epilepsy, they're finding that C10 may be beneficial, to certain people with epilepsy. So C10, and another group just recently also showed that astrocytes actually prefer the medium chain triglycerides to the ketone beta hydroxybutyrate. Neurons prefer the ketone beta hydroxybutyrate. So
Wow.
if you're eating some, MCT oil, coconut oil, and also say taking a ketone ester, where you're getting the ketone directly,
Yeah.
your neurons can use the ketone and your astrocytes can use the MCTs to operate, which they'll further convert to more beta hydroxybutyrate, the ketone, and shuttle it to the neurons to provide nutrition to the neurons. So
Wow. So what we're saying is
there's really
you're
reasons to
saying
take
like
do
a
all of this.
cocktail of all this is better than the sum parts of itself. So you're taking the MCT oils to get
Yes.
the MCTs convert to ketones. You're taking exogenous ketones as well, and full on coconut, and the three together
Mhm.
are, in my simplistic brain, in the past, because I take exogenous ketones regularly. Take MCT oil. I'd stop coconut oil. I'm now, as of today, going to start putting that back in. But the cocktail of the three,
Yeah.
they all overlap around ketosis and ketones, but also they're doing slightly other things that are also
Mhm.
beneficial.
Exactly.
Wow,
Exactly. And the
amazing.
ketones, for example, beta hydroxybutyrate is very anti-inflammatory. And it targets the this thing called the NLRP3 inflammasome, which is at the core of the inflammation in Alzheimer's. It actually targets that specific type of inflammation. And probably more so than MCTs, but there's still a lot to learn about these medium chain triglycerides as well.
Sure.
But it is known that that the ketone beta hydroxybutyrate targets this specific type of inflammation. So, there's benefit to taking all of these things. And, I've been following people, started writing to me. I mean, I wrote a little paper. I called it Alzheimer's disease. What if there was a cure and what if there was a cure for Alzheimer's disease and no one knew? I wrote this article 2 months after my husband improved, and it was just a little case report. It talked about, what happened with him, but also about Dr. Beach's ketone ester, and that you could get much higher ketone levels, that potentially this could be a cure for Alzheimer's. Dr. Beach, believed that if somebody got this early enough, they might completely be able to prevent it, and that people that had it might improve significantly. So I wrote this paper. I tried to present at the Alzheimer's Association conference to bring it there as an exhibit in 2008. They basically turned me down. They I hate to say, but it seemed like they almost suppressed the information. But they had that medical food company. The food became known as Axona, and they had an exhibit of that at that conference in 2008. I went anyway, and attended the conference. But since then, that little article, we started sending it out online. I put it in health food stores locally. I left it in health food stores in Chicago, handed it out to many people there, and eventually it got out on the internet. And then I was invited to do a radio program locally, and then we had there was a news article about it, and they interviewed Dr. Veach and Dr. Van Italy and these researchers about the potential for ketones to help people. So it kind of went viral. And then I started hearing from people who tried it. And most of them I actually have collected. I just recently put together an abstract that I'm submitting to the Alzheimer's Association. But between 2008 and 2014, I collected about 360 little, you might call them mini case reports, and 288 were people that had some kind of memory problem like Alzheimer's, dementia, dementia with Parkinson's, subjective memory impairment, where they have brain fog, that type of thing.
Yeah.
And 90% of them reported to me that they had improved. And 3/4 of those were people who were only taking coconut oil.
Wow.
And then the other, like roughly 25%, were people that had added MCT oil. They started with coconut oil and then they added MCT oil. And I figure people are more likely to, tell me about this if they have improvement, maybe less likely if they don't. So it's not really a scientific study, but it's just an example. It's a large collection of anecdotes, testimonials about people who believe they improved. And some of them had very detailed descriptions of what the person was like before and how they improved. And these were people like Alzheimer's. There was a lady with Down syndrome. So I had one lady write to me in 2013, and her husband had very recently been diagnosed with Alzheimer's by 3 different neurologists, believed he had Alzheimer's. He was in his 80s. And she started giving him coconut and MCT oil and smoothies, and she had upped it to 2 or 3 times a day and saw very significant improvement. She had given me very, very detailed description at the time of, what type of problems he was having and how he responded to it. And she stayed in touch with me. I'd hear from her periodically. And then in 2016, so this is 4 years later, the ketone salts came out on the market. And my sister Angela was helping with emails, and she notified a lot of people to let them know this. And she was one of them, this lady whose husband had Alzheimer's. And she started this with him. And then she let us know, she said, wow, he's actually improving. He was doing this, this, and this, and now he's able to do this and this. And then in 2018, the ketone ester that Dr. Veach had invented actually came out on the market. And she added that, and it bumped them up even further. And we actually got to meet her and her husband. They live in California. We were out there for a conference. He carried on a perfectly wonderful conversation, a lot of memories in it. He was quite elderly, getting into his 90s. So he basically went 10 full years where he improved and stabilized. And his last 2 evaluations, they said he had mild cognitive impairment, which precedes Alzheimer's. So, he had a dramatic, very sustained improvement. And sadly, his name's Joe. He, at 94, he had a cardiac problem that he'd had for years, and he passed away from heart failure related to his advanced age, but he did not have dementia. I mean, at that point, he did not have Alzheimer's. And I believe he is, here in America, there's a commercial. The first survivor of Alzheimer's is still out there. It's put out by the Alzheimer's Association. Joe, to me, was the first survivor of Alzheimer's. He did not die of Alzheimer's. He was actually better than he was 10 years ago,
Wow.
10 years earlier.
So I've got a list of questions. I've got a list of questions building up. This is fascinating. The first thing I'll say is, don't apologize. You apologized a moment ago for saying, this isn't a clinical trial. These are just people that have been in touch, and it's a couple of hundred. My opinion is if
Right.
you need a clinical trial of thousands and thousands and thousands to show that your drug helps 1 in 100 people or something like that, then it's probably not that
Right.
beneficial. For me, real life stories, when you're in touch with them and you're seeing the
Mhm.
results, because at the end of the day, these clinical trials, and there is a place for them. Don't get me wrong. There is definitely a place for clinical trials, and I'm knocking
Right.
them. And I believe very much
Mhm.
in all the aspects of, locking people up in a room and making sure they're randomised and they're controlled and how they're measured and. But that's if a drug
Yeah.
is marginally beneficial. You're talking about a natural product,
Yeah.
and therefore no harm is created, and
Natural
therefore,
product of food.
yeah. So that's my
Yeah.
first one, was an observation. Don't apologize. Quite often, epidemiology
Yeah.
and quite often
Yeah.
one-on-one stories
Yeah.
way outweighs the benefits of a clinical trial. Point one, not a question,
Yeah.
but 3 questions coming
Yeah.
up now. First question.
Yeah. I agree. I have something I'd like to say about that.
Yeah,
So,
sure.
clinical trials for drugs are also trying to find out if they are safe, if there are toxicities that are going to cause serious adverse effects. And coconut oil has already been tested, as has MCT oil. MCT oil and coconut oil have been used in infant formulas since the 1980s, and they're still used today. Nearly every commercial infant formula has coconut oil, and many of them also have MCT oil in them for like premature babies, babies that have intestinal issues. So it's been tested. It's been tested. It's food. A billion people or so in tropical parts of the world, and mainly in Asia, have been consuming coconut oil as a staple in their diet for millennia. Probably since the beginning of human life. The
Yeah,
coconut was a food that was available in these regions. And so it's already known not to have serious adverse effects, toxicities. So I do think, and then penicillin. There was one anecdote, one man who responded to this first batch of penicillin that was grown in a lab. Insulin was tried on one person,
wow.
and with diabetes, type 1 diabetes,
Yeah,
and that person responded to insulin and survived.
yeah,
So, anecdotes are the beginning of many different types of treatments, historically speaking. And, when you have a pile of them, like I do, such a collection. And then, I mean, many other people, I mean, I just don't have personal documentation that
sure.
somebody communicated with me, but I've heard about many other people that have had some improvement. And, it's like, well, why would it oil, but you think DHA, we talk about omega-3 fatty acids, how important it is to take fish oil, and DHA, that these are essential fatty acids. And I think perhaps medium chain triglycerides are essential fatty acids too.
Yeah,
And, infants get them in breast milk. They're in human breast milk. They're in the infant formulas. They're getting them that way. Ketones are building blocks of the lipids in the brain for the newborn baby. While they're developing, they provide a lot of the fuel. A brand new baby who's strictly breastfed goes into ketosis, and they start breaking down their fat. They get medium chain triglycerides in breast milk immediately. And then when the baby's weaned, and here in the U.S., to me, it's appalling because they are told to eat a low-fat diet after after they've been getting this very fat-rich milk. It's 50% fat, human breast milk, and it's about almost 30% saturated fat. And some of that saturated fat are these medium chain triglycerides. And then they're weaned from that. They're taken off formulas, which also have those things trying to mimic breast milk. And then they're told to eat low fat or fat-free dairy. That's what their parents are instructed here in the
sad.
US. And dairy, even cow milk and goat milk, fat have medium chain triglycerides in them. Mammal milk has medium chain triglycerides. And butter it's in butter, it's in cheeses. And smaller amounts than in coconut oil. Coconut oil is just the richest source of it, naturally speaking. So why.
Yeah.
There's a big whole history behind this low fat idea. But it's tragic, because they might be essential fatty acids. you know could it be related to autism? I mean, that's possibility. I'm just asking that question.
Well, it's a good,
many other
it's a good, it's a
conditions,
good,
if you're getting medium
it's a good question.
triglycerides.
It's a great question to ask because,
Yeah,
omega-3 is definitely an
yeah.
essential acid in the fact that we can't create it in the body, so we have to get omega-3. I would raise a question these days when you see what kids are growing up on for breakfast and for lunch and sandwiches at school and pizza at the evening. Where on earth is the omega-3 coming from? Like virtually non-existent, and yet we need it because the brain is full of
Right.
it. And then,
Yeah.
yes, maybe MCTs. In some ways, you
It,
would argue
but
straight away that MCTs probably are essential simply because it's in breast milk. So there's a reason why it's in breast milk. So
right,
fascinating. So a few
right.
questions. In fact, not a question. Here's an interesting one for you. About 4 years ago, a bunch of doctors and I, we decided to see what would happen to the human body if you ran 4 marathons in 5 days with zero food. Okay, so on the Sunday we had our last steak, and then we
Wow.
ran marathon, no calories whatsoever. And the interesting thing is, we had to obviously be then in ketosis because we were not consuming anything. And for those days, I was seeing colors
Right.
I've never seen before. My brain thinking was clearer than it's ever been before. And being a businessman, for my entire
Yeah.
business life, I'd wake up in the middle of the night and write, oh, there's a business idea. I'd write it down. And the next morning I'd wake up and it'd be complete nonsense. It's like, oh, what a waste of waking up in the night. But that week, I was writing things down and I'd wake the next morning and it was the most brilliant writing I'd ever done. It was like fantastic. So we were seeing colors, I could hear things.
Yeah.
And then last year in May, I
Yeah.
did the
Yeah.
same experiment again. I did with a bunch of doctors, 500 miles, 5 days on a bike this time, same again. So for me, it really came to about last May was I've got to stay in ketosis as much as I can. I've got the APOE4 gene as well, which means, as you know, I'm more likely to get Alzheimer's because I've got the APO4
My
gene.
husband.
And therefore, staying in ketosis for me just seems totally logical because my brain's just in a better place. What do we think? And I was at a conference, the conference we were both at in America recently, and lots of speakers were talking about ketosis
Yeah.
and therapeutic being between sort of ketones 1 and ketones 2 on the way of measuring it. Do you have a view on what therapeutical
Yeah.
ketone levels we should be aiming for if we're concerned about things like Alzheimer's?
Yeah. Even apparently zero point 0.5 and higher can be beneficial. In the MCT oil study, in which nearly half the people with Alzheimer's improved, they were aiming for levels of 0.5, 0.6, 0.7 with the MCT oil, and people improved with that. There are other studies out there of ketogenic diet for Alzheimer's that have shown good results. Ketogenic diet with MCT oil, it showed good results. And, basically, most of the people were running between 0.5 and 1 millimole. I think higher than that might be a little bit better, but, um, you know, um, it doesn't necessarily have to be extremely high levels to get results. And, many people that have written to me, communicated with me are, taking like the ketone ester. Dr. Veach thought you would need 150 grams a day of ketone ester. That's a lot.
Wow.
But there are people taking 5 grams a couple times a day that are reporting improvement with it. So and the levels would be, probably in the 0.5 to 1 millimole range, as opposed to the 4 to 5 millimole range. My husband did take the ketone ester. I don't. Are you aware of that?
I was going to ask you, what's the difference? I have
That my
I have a powder that I take in a drink, but that's not an ester. That's ketones in a drink. What's the difference between that and that comes with the salts
It's called like
rather than
ketone salts.
yeah? What's the difference between ketone
Right.
salts and esters? Maybe you could explain that to me.
Yeah, okay. So ketone salts are the ketone beta hydroxybutyrate, and they're combined with sodium, potassium, calcium, magnesium. Some companies sell only the sodium, or they'll sell sodium and potassium, but if they really want to balance it and do a good job with these ketone salts, they combine sodium, potassium, calcium, magnesium, which are all minerals that we need. We need to get them in our diet, and we don't want to overdo the sodium too much, especially if you are at risk for high blood pressure or have high blood pressure. So those are the salts. The levels after you have a typical serving of the salts may go up by zero point 0.1 or 1 millimole, maybe a little higher for some people. Okay, the ketone ester is completely different in that it combines, well, this particular ester combines beta hydroxybutyrate with another substance called butanediol, which sounds like fuel. Well, it is fuel, basically. Um, and it's combined in one molecule. Dr. Veach decided to do that because taking the ketone acid itself is acidic, and he felt, it could be damaging to the stomach because of the quantity that he thought people would need to take. So he found a way, being a biochemist too, to combine butanediol and beta hydroxybutyrate to form what's called an ester, a ketone ester. Mm-hmm. And when you consume this, the butanediol releases, after digestion from the beta hydroxybutyrate, but the butanediol is also converted to more beta hydroxybutyrate.
Right, okay.
So it's kind of neat trick. It's a way that he thought would help sustain the ketone level too. It doesn't do a great job of that in its current form. It kind of peaks at about 30 to 60 minutes, and then it starts dropping off. And after 3 or 4 hours, the levels completely back down to the baseline again. And that also happens with the ketone salts. They're temporary.
Sure.
They'll last maybe 3 or 4 hours that you'll have elevated ketones.
Yeah.
So
I guess the key
that's
thing
basically the difference. But with the ketone ester.
Yeah. Sorry, I interrupted.
I was going to say,
okay.
with the ketone ester, with the ketone ester, your levels can pop up instead of 0.5 to 1, 4 to 5 millimoles, depending on how much you take, in 30 minutes. So those are levels that would take 10 days of starvation to get to. Basically.
Yeah. And I guess the jury's going to be about what is a therapeutical range. I mean, I like say try now to stick between 1 and 2, and I tend to eat fairly a carnivore diet, so I don't find that some mornings when I measure my ketones, I don't need to take anything because it's just fine. Mm-hmm. I've had my MCT all in my coffee already, and 2 hours later, if the ketones are fine, I don't take it. If on a day for some reason maybe a little bit more vegetables crept in than meat, and my ketones are down, then I'll take the drink, and it comes back up nicely. But and I guess again, none of this is medical advice. We're just saying that there is starting to be a lot of groundswell around a therapeutical range to stay in ketosis, which obviously works nice with the low carb approach to living, which works nice to a carnivore way of living or a ketogenic diet. And if you're particularly worried about things like Alzheimer's and dementia, Parkinson's and so on, then why not, if you've got the inclination and the time, you don't have to make a massive change in the diet to keep running on ketones rather than fat. And then once you've had that experience of your brain feeling great and and alert and seeing colours you've never seen before, and I just don't see why you'd ever want to go back.
Yeah, right. You do feel so much better. And, when you're on a ketogenic diet, the carb cravings aren't there either, which is a relief. I mean, when I was on that convenience food diet, I'd have cereal, it had fiber in it, it had that heart healthy check on it, and I ate it with skim milk, and I would feel hungry. I mean, I'd eat a big bowl of cereal. I was still hungry. I wanted more, always hungry, always thinking about when am I going to get that next sugar fix, basically. Yep. And as soon as we started the Mediterranean diet, within 3 days that went away. Yeah. And it's never come back for me. When eventually it became a more ketogenic diet for me too, as I learned the benefits of the ketogenic diet, which I wasn't too aware of other than for epilepsy up to that point. But there are many health benefits. I feel much healthier now. I'm turning 71 tomorrow.
Oh, happy birthday.
I feel much healthier now than I did when I was. Yeah, thank you. I feel much healthier than when I was 50 years old. Much healthier than when I was 50. Yeah, I had all kinds of things that went away, after I changed my diet, and I don't have any of those problems now. It's really amazing. So that's like many benefits. And mental clarity too. Yeah. Mental endurance is what I found for myself when I started taking MCT oil. I needed to read a lot. I was constantly writing to, media and politicians and, about this thing, emails, answering, and I just felt like I had increased mental endurance related to that, and that hasn't really gone away. I think it's helped me write those books that you showed earlier.
Yeah, all available in the UK. I'll just show that up to the camera over there. All 4 of Mary's books you will find on
Yeah.
Amazon. And if you don't, email me and I'll find them for you because they're all fantastic. I want to pick up on one of the things. We talk a lot about Alzheimer's and how it can help. And I'm going to keep saying the question, what if a spoonful of coconut oil each day could reverse or slow down the symptoms of Alzheimer's? Because it kind of could be as simple as that. You also mentioned Parkinson's. And are we saying the same if you have Parkinson's or worry about Parkinson's because it's in the family? Again, taking some MCT oil and coconut oil and potentially exogenous, I can never say that word, exogenous ketones may help.
Ketones, right. Yeah. So I told you about those case reports that I'd collected, and many of the people with Parkinson's also had memory issues, but there were also other people who had Parkinson's but didn't mention memory issues. But I have collected 40 something, it's over 40 communications with people with Parkinson's that felt that they improved. Some just with coconut oil, some did coconut oil and added the MCT. There's a man with Parkinson's here in the US. I don't think he would mind me saying his name. He's got videos out on YouTube. His name's Bill Curtis. He actually lived near Dr. Beach. He went and spent time in his lab, and he responded. He started taking in his coffee, he was adding cream, butter, and coconut oil. Dr. Beach had suggested that he try this. So it was a very high fat morning coffee. And his symptoms greatly improved.
Wow.
His tremors, his stiffness, he could walk normally. And, he did very well. And then he started adding other things to that, doing overnight fasting to get his ketone level up. And then he was doing morning exercise. He was walking for 30 minutes and walking up and down hills. And then more recently, he added the ketone ester in the morning before he does his exercise. He also does strength training with his exercise. And eating a low carb diet. So he eats what he calls a low glycemic index diet. He doesn't eat the simple sugars. And he has done extraordinarily well. His symptoms improved dramatically 7 years ago, like way down. The scores go down if you improve with Parkinson's on this particular test. And he has sustained that. He hasn't had any further increase in medications since then. He was a man who he was working at high level computer related in a financial institution, that type of a job, had to quit working at 57, I believe, and was stuck in a chair. He could hardly get out of a chair. And now he is going to conferences. He's actively writing all of the time. He stays very busy, and he's written about ketones. He just recently, there was a paper published with his protocol, and it very detailed look at the mechanism. It's if you're even if you're a doctor, you might have a hard time reading and understanding it. It's so complex what he has written. It's just amazing for somebody that couldn't work and could not get out of a chair. He wasn't even able to focus on his computer, when he was at work. That was part of the problem.
And although it's a complex,
so he's out there trying to tell the world.
Yeah, even though it's complex, back to what you're talking about earlier on with MCT oils, with mitochondria biogenesis, so you're creating more, a mitochondria, especially in our brain cells where we have multiple, some cells only have a couple of mitochondria. We have many in our brain cells. Well, if he's combining the MCT oils, which you're saying may help with mitochondria biogenesis, and exercise, which we know increases mitochondria biogenesis, but in our brains, or in my brain, I've always associated that creating of it of cells in the muscles you're actually actively using in the exercise. But if that at the same time is helping put more battery cells in the brain cells, it kind of all makes a lot of sense.
Exactly.
Yeah.
It does. And that's the issue. That's exactly, it's the mitochondria is what he talks about. And part of it, the mitochondria become defective, and they're not, the defective ones aren't being removed and replaced with new healthy mitochondria in Parkinson's. That's a simple way of explaining what's going on. It's much more complex than that. But when you do these things, you do replace, you clear out the bad ones, that have become defective, and you supply more new healthy
Yeah.
mitochondria.
Yeah.
So that's the mechanism that he believes is going on in Parkinson's disease. But Alzheimer's also has mitochondrial dysfunction. Many neurological diseases do.
Yeah.
I believe that's the mechanism for other neurological diseases as well. But he has had really a dramatic improvement, sustained improvement. So he's been trying to get the message out there, for people with Parkinson's. And that first book that you had read, I was addressing Alzheimer's and Parkinson's, and I wanted to add and diabetes too, because people with diabetes are at very high risk, for developing dementia. It's about a third of people with diabetes will go on to develop dementia. That's very high. In the general population, it's about 5%.
Yeah.
So, we're talking 33%. That's
Yeah.
much higher risk, and it's related to insulin resistance and cells not being able to get glucose into cells, including brain cells. And another thing we didn't talk about too much was this brain energy gap that happens as people age. This is something Dr. Cunane, who does the ketone and glucose PET scans, he has scanned hundreds of people, of adults of all ages, young healthy adults, older healthy adults, people without memory problems, but also people with mild cognitive impairment and with Alzheimer's disease. And what he has identified is what he calls a brain energy gap. So it's a gap between how much energy your brain needs and how much it actually gets. And even say you're in you're 70, say you're 70, you're my age, and you test normal on memory tests, that person likely has a 7 to 9% gap in their brain energy that they're not getting. And it's well known that the brain shrinks a tiny bit every year as you get older. It might be related to that lack, missing energy there, that gap in the energy. A person with mild cognitive impairment, this increases to 10 or 12%. Somebody with mild Alzheimer's, it's 20% gap between the energy the brain needs and what it gets.
Wow.
And it just gets worse from there. It may get up to 40% or more in somebody with Alzheimer's disease. So,
Can I
the
can I just
ketones,
stop
the
you there
cool
because
thing about the ketones.
I want to stop you just
Yeah,
there
yeah.
because I want to pick up on this because I think it's very, very interesting and I think it's very important we get this across. So my mum and dad, I'm sorry to everybody that watches my podcast, I've said this 1,000 times, but my mum and dad been together since they were 14, had every single meal together. In the last few years, last decade, dad gets diagnosed with diabetes type 2. Mum gets, has got very bad Alzheimer's. And what I try and explain to people, they're one and the same thing, just manifesting in different ways. Dad's manifested with his diabetes because they've had the same meal. I don't think they've ever had a different meal. But Mum, I want to try and say to people, in some ways, Alzheimer's is a bit like, and I don't want to simplify it, but you need to sometimes, it's a bit like diabetes type 3, a lot of people are talking about. And I'm going to say something now, and then I'd like you to explain it even better than I would. But I say, look, the brain will run on sugar. It will. But if you keep fueling it sugar, and it becomes insulin resistant in the brain, now you've not got enough fuel. But if you are constantly still eating carbohydrate heavy diets, then you can't get ketones to your brain, which is the alternative
You're keep
fuel.
making that worse.
You're making it worse. So if we can change your fuel source and get the carbs right down to now we're running on ketones, we've got a brand new fuel source, and a fuel source that the brain does not become resistant to. So as far as we know, there's nothing like such thing as ketone resistance in the brain. You now can fill that gap up because now you're giving it a new energy source. Is that a fair way of describing it, Mary?
Right. Oh, exactly. And there are actually two published case reports about this. I mean, there are studies of people with type 2 diabetes going into remission. Their fasting blood sugar becomes normal, hemoglobin A1C becomes normal when they're on a low carb diet for a prolonged period of time, and they lose weight. I mean, all kinds of positive things happen. But there are two case reports now that were published there was a man and a woman, different cases. Both had diabetes, insulin resistance. She had pre-diabetes. He had diabetes for years. Both were overweight. Both were diagnosed with mild Alzheimer's disease. And they were placed on a ketogenic diet. And after 10 weeks on the diet, and the program also included some exercise and brain training kind of things, they both of them, their blood sugar improved, hemoglobin A1C improved, their blood pressure came down, triglycerides came down, insulin levels came down. They lost weight, they did so much better. But the key thing for these two people is that the man had that mini mental status exam, well, equivalent, it's called the MOCA, it's a similar test, 30-point test. His score improved from 23, which was considered mild Alzheimer's, to 29 out of 30 points, which is normal. Her score improved from 21 out of 30 to 28 out of 30, which is also considered normal. So they both had been diagnosed with mild Alzheimer's.
Yeah.
And they improved. So, this kind of, it points to, again, they're anecdotes. So hopefully many more people will be studied. But, they actually reverse not only their diabetes, but also apparently their Alzheimer's disease.
Yeah, but the problem is we're not talking about a drug, so there probably won't be clinical trials because nobody can make money out of something you can go and get out of a tree. That's the. I wrote this down. I wrote this down earlier on. I mean, you've been telling everybody about this for years, for 9 years now, I think. And yet, why doesn't everybody know about it? Your books are brilliant. Your one book here,
since 2008.
This is top 50 bestseller on Amazon, top 50 bestseller. And yet, so this is no secret, but it's been kept a secret, I think deliberately suppressed, because no big drug company, none of the biggest industry in the world, the drug companies, can't really make any money on anything. You can go and get out of a tree, which you can't patent. If you can't patent it, you can't make loads of money. If you can't make loads of money, they won't do the clinical trials. And this is where we have to say that the true life stories of your husband, Steve, and the other people you've mentioned in the last hour, people should take note because this is real life.
Right. And there are some clinical trials that are happening. And the Alzheimer's Association is actually funding some of them, and they have been reported now the last few years at their conferences, and these are reports that show improvement in cognition and memory, which none of the drugs can ever claim. They claim to maybe slow down the decline a little bit for maybe 6 months, but they never claim to improve memory or cognition. So one of the researchers and I, had this discussion recently, and it's like, this is the year we're going to get to the Alzheimer's Association and ask them, you're funding studies of this nutritional approach, MCT oil and or ketogenic diet, and showing improvement in cognition and memory. Why isn't that the big news?
Yeah.
Why isn't that the big news? Instead, the big news are these drugs that show promise. Even in animal studies, sometimes they'll report major breakthrough, and when it's got years before it could possibly come to market. And 400 such trials have failed of drugs for Alzheimer's. And so, we're hoping to try to get through the people that control the message, from the Alzheimer's Association, because if you look on their website, you look up medium chain triglycerides or you look up coconut oil, I mean, there's nothing that supports it. The last thing they have is, it needs clinical trials. Well, there have been clinical trials. You've paid for them and they've been presented at your conference. Why aren't you touting this? Why aren't you letting the world know about this?
Because everybody relies or wants to believe that there's a pill for every ill and eventually they'll find the magic pill. And yet sometimes we just have to turn back to nature and say, there's a natural, way of slowing it down, potentially even slightly reversing it, but there's not any money to be made out of it. And that's why, I support you. Exactly. I think you're wonderful. I think we just need to get everybody buying your books, reading more, spreading this message. And fascinating. Look, I've loved talking to you. I normally end with, give me 3 things that Dr. Mary Newport would suggest for healthy longevity. but I think it's going to be MCT
Mm,
coconut and exogenous ketones maybe, but
yeah.
I don't know. Over to you.
Oh,
Let's summarize with a message to, we'll just keep it around Alzheimer's and
right.
Parkinson
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
brain function, I think.
So, yeah. Right. So, I would say healthy diet
Yeah,
is number one. Um, eating whole foods, getting away from ultra processed foods that are loaded with sugar and high fructose corn syrup and refined grains like, white flour is 90% sugar, white rice is 80 or 90% sugar, getting away from those kind of foods, eating whole foods, whole grains. I think that's really important, and as part of that diet, including medium chain triglycerides. So incorporating, don't be afraid of the fat. Eat a lower carb diet. Like here in the US, well, people eat a plate full of pasta, spaghetti, and put, a little bit of tomato sauce and some meat on the top of it. And I advise people cut your uh, carbs like that in half. The bread, the pasta, the cereal, the rice, cut it in half. And when you're used to that, cut it in half again. Eat much smaller portions, and then consider not eating some of those things
yeah.
at all. Getting away from sweets and starchy foods. Forget the sugary beverages. Coca-Cola, Pepsi. Really bad for your brain. There's studies showing that it accelerates brain aging. Um, and start thinking, coconut oil is not an unhealthy fat. There are a lot of myths out there about it that are just wrong. Eating more fat in your diet, monounsaturated fats, olive oil, nuts, seeds, avocados, things like that, contain healthy fats. So, and then the next thing is to get exercise. That's also extremely important to maintain functionality as you get older. But it also does, it stimulates ketones. Ketones are actually produced when you exercise, and a substance called BDNF that helps stimulate the growth of brain cells, can help regenerate your brain, so to speak. So I think those are, my messages.
I don't know. We haven't covered BDNF, although I have got Dr. Boz coming on shortly, and I'm sure she'll talk about BNDF. But in case she doesn't, and because if you only go back 10 years ago, people went, once you lose a brain cell, you can't regrow it. It's like your eyes never regrow your teeth and your brain. But now they're going, actually, you can replace certain brain cells with BDNF. Just quickly, a
You
1 minute,
can.
a 1 minute or two on that, please, Mary.
Yes. So, yeah, like you said, they thought, you had all the brain cells you were going to have by the time you're 3 or 4 years old. But we do make new brain cells. I found one study in which they estimate something like 1,400 new neurons a day.
Wow.
Your neurons, you do tend to have, you can have for life. I mean, apparently neurons can live 120 years. So that's what the belief is, but they can be damaged, and they can be replaced. One of the cool things with ketones is that there are studies of neurons in cultures, and there are outgrowths from these neurons, that the neurons are growing when they're subjected to like an atmosphere where they have ketones in the mix. So this is something that is known, and BDNF is part of that. It's a substance that ketones seem to somehow be involved with stimulating BDNF. Um, so we want to replace damaged neurons if at all possible. So I think, that's something to think about. Another thing to think about, as far as going the ketogenic route
Well, you're
and
amazing.
getting exercise.
And getting exercise. Look, I've loved our time together. Anything we can do here at Health Results to help you get your message out, honestly, this has really helped my dad, with my mom, and it hasn't sadly reversed it anyway, but she was declining so quickly that we feel it's certainly slowed that down. And fascinating book. This one I know is available in Amazon right now. The other three, I bought them here, so I know that you can get them, but this one, absolutely a great place to start. Mary, been an absolute pleasure and a dream of mine to have you on the show. Thank you very, very much for all your time.
Oh, you're welcome, Steve. I really appreciate your inviting me on the show. I'm all about getting this message out, and you're helping in a big way.
Oh, thank you very much. God bless. And hopefully we'll see you at a conference in the UK at some time.
I would love to do that. I love the UK. I've been there a few times.
Okay, well, I'm going to try and get you on the roster at the Public Health Collaboration, which is obviously the charity that I fund, which we have our annual conference. I'm going to try and get you on next year for sure.
Okay, that sounds great to me.
You have to hold me to it, just in case my APOE4 gets the better of me.
Yeah, well, you're doing everything you can to fight it. So you're doing all the right things.
That's just what I need to know. Mary, God bless you. Thank you very much indeed for your time.
Yes.
Well, I hope you enjoyed that. You know, we talk a lot on this show about diabetes. We talk about metabolic syndrome a lot, but you know, a whole show there dedicated to Alzheimer's, the brain, touched on Parkinson's a little bit, and the messages there were, and I learned a lot, and hopefully you did as well, because I was doing a lot of, and still do a lot of MCT8 oils, which is the bit that's separated from the whole coconut oil. I used to do coconut oil, then went MCT8, but now I'm going to go back to both. Exogenous, I can never say that word, exogenous ways of getting ketones in as well. You should look at those and measure your ketones. Do your own research what you believe the therapeutic range is. I'm aiming between 1 mmol to 2 mmol, way below an area, sort of a range that becomes ketoacidosis, because that's way, way, way higher. So yeah, have a look at it, understand it, measure it, maybe watch that movie again, and keep doing what you're doing. You know, all these diseases we worry about, we can now add Alzheimer's to the likes of diabetes and heart disease and all that, that there is a preventable element to it.